Hi, everybody. This is Patrick from Seattle, Blessed Peacemaker, or Surrounded by Darkness. I hope that this message either is very uplifting to you or is something that will kind of kickstart you to get going where you need to go, because I feel our time is short. And whether it's short or not, we never know what the next day will bring for us. You don't want to delay. You don't want to wait too long. So I was reading the book of Joel in Joel 2:28, and it says, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions." I'd like to be, and I feel like I am, but I'm not a young man anymore. And I've been going through some stuff like everybody has that I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out what my next step is and where I'm supposed to end up. So I've been praying hard for guidance and asking that I could have my dreams. First, actually, my request is that my wife and kids could have visions and dreams to guide them and us. And then after that, if they're on their way, I ask that I could have some too, because I'm really looking for guidance. And I think I've mentioned previously that instead of take up your sword or run into battle with me or I need men who will follow me, what I'm getting is be still and I'll fight for you. Or excuse me, be quiet and I'll fight for you. Be still, know that I'm your God. And those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. And I'm not good at waiting or being still or being quiet. So it's a kind of frustrating time for me. But regardless, I did have a very interesting and, for me, kind of disturbing dream the other day that I'd like to share with you. Now, in the book of Joel, also in Joel 1:5, it says, "Awake, you drunkards, and weep and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the sweet wine, for it is cut off from your mouth." And I think that time is coming, and there are numerous passages of warning that I could share with you. However, this is a dream of warning. Now, before I explain the dream, I think I should explain perspective just a little bit. Um, I've been a police officer for 32 years. I recently retired. I started in corrections and then moved into law enforcement and have served and I believe answered my calling in that capacity. I always worked very busy urban areas. And of course, in those areas, you deal a lot with gangs and drugs and crime and other things. But also in the areas that I work specifically, they were rife with prostitution. And uh, here in this area, in the Seattle area, the area that I worked specifically was the area where the Green River Killer uh, killed a lot of his victims, most of whom were prostitutes, if not all. Um, I was working here. I wasn't a part of it, but I was working here when he was finally arrested. So I've always had a big heart for the men and women who've been forced, quite literally, into prostitution. No children grow up saying, when I grow up, I want to be addicted to drugs, living on the streets, and a prostitute. When I grow up, I want to be beaten and abused by men. I want to throw away my life and perhaps end up dead at the hands of another person or by drug overdose or violence. Nobody grows up saying that. I will say that there's a weird deviation in society lately with the internet and some of the things as some of these young girls are exposed to um, pornography and other things at a very early age. There are some girls, very young, that I've encountered, teenagers, who do want to be prostitutes because they feel that will propel them into stardom in um, porn and strip clubs, etc. Um, and the two are synonymous. If you think that the women who and men who are acting are not performing acts of prostitution, not only on the screen, but in addition to that, you're very mistaken. Um, Again, there's a strange element that I have a hard time understanding that has given into culture, and they do want that, but most don't grow up saying that. And regardless if they did want it or not, I think that um, the majority of the people who end up in that um, horrific and difficult lifestyle, I think that they are probably surprised, unpleasantly surprised by what they encounter. So, uh, we used to arrest prostitutes and charge them with a crime. Prostitution is illegal where I work in Washington State, where I worked previously in California, and in most states in the United States. However, we realized that we were targeting literal victims, and they were the men and women that end up in that profession often are abused sexually, physically, emotionally at a very early age, and turn to drugs to get away from that, and end up turning to prostitution to support their drug habit. And when that happens to a person, especially at a young age, their morale and self-esteem is destroyed by these predators who do that to them. So we took the attitude, instead of arresting the prostitutes, that we would try to help them to get out of that system. And instead, we would arrest the people victimizing them, the men who solicit that behavior and who hurt them, and quite literally hurt them. Very often, these women are physically harmed, abused, and like I mentioned earlier, sometimes even killed doing what they're doing. And especially the men who, the predators who force them into that profession to support them, not to even to support themselves. Most of their money goes to that person, that pimp, if you will, who's forcing them into that. Now, in the Bible, prostitution is very often used to explain the apostasy of God's followers as they turn to other false gods and worship them and false idols, and as they turn their backs on God. And there's some very difficult and graphic language and imagery in the Bible that talks about the prostitution as people turn away towards others from God. And so a few days ago, I had a dream. And in the dream, I was working in as a police officer in uniform, in official capacity, and we had a young, very young lady detained who was a prostitute. And we were trying to negotiate and talk to her and explaining that we were trying to help her. And she was very obstinate and loud, and um, wouldn't wasn't hearing what we were saying, wasn't listening to what we were saying. At one point, she was writhing and uh, broke away from me and then began running. Um, and again, we have the ability, we have probable cause and legal premise to arrest and charge those people involved in prostitution. But that wasn't our intent. Our intent was to help get her some services. And there's some excellent services, especially some Christian based services in this area, some started by a friend of mine to help especially young women, but men and women, get off the streets and clean up their act and get away from that harmful, broken lifestyle. And this person, she was a very broken, small, frail person who was putting on this very loud, raucous, boisterous, assaultive front to cover up for her frailty and her weakness. And so as she ran from me, I again wasn't trying to arrest her. I was trying to bring her back in because I knew the great harm she was at being out there. And I was trying to catch her, to bring her back and reason with her and remove her from that harm, protect her from that harm. Better way to say it. And so as she ran, I was walking after her, calling out to her gently. And she was frantic and running quickly and occasionally would stop at a location and then continue on. And I still had her in sight and I didn't want to scare her more, so I wasn't specifically running, but I was afraid as she ran because occasionally I lost sight of her. And at one point, she ran into a huge sports stadium full of people. And in the dream, I somehow knew or thought that it was the Super Bowl because it was that many people. It was just thousands and thousands of loud people and drunks and noise. And I became very worried and concerned. And I was afraid that I would completely lose her because she was far enough ahead, moving through a very heavy crowd, and she couldn't hear me anymore as I called out to her. The din, the noise of the crowd was clearly louder than me, and I couldn't compete with that. And I kept losing sight of her. But I could see over the heads of the people and through the crowd and occasionally catch a glimpse of her as she ran away from me and then turned around to look over her shoulder to see if I was still following. And I was. And uh, I was very worried. And interesting side note, the Super Bowl in the United States is one of the biggest and best known events for human trafficking in the United States annually. Women, especially, and men are brought in massive numbers and forced to work serving the people who come from out of town from all over the world in prostitution. It's a shameful undercurrent that is not often talked about when we talk about the two games or the two teams on the field playing the game. So as I chased her, I was very frustrated because she was not listening to me. Um, she wasn't hearing what I had to say, and she was pushing herself farther and farther into harm's way. And when she, at one point, ran into a very crowded bar, um, I followed her in. And as I went in, I felt nauseous and sick to my stomach because of the sights that I saw. We know that Jesus said that in the end of days, and I believe we're pretty close to that, that it would be like the days of Lot or the days of Noah. And we know that in those days, in both examples, they were rife with sin and violence and depravity and immorality. And that's what I saw when I walked in. It was shocking. The overt um, sexual acts that were being performed and the way that people were acting contrary to their nature and the deviancy that was taking place. And the place was pretty crowded, and I completely lost sight of her. And I was just sick and worried and a bit angry, frankly, because this was not the place that would help her to thrive. This probably sounds dumb, but I mean, truly my concern was for her, and that's how I operate, and that's how I've always operated: is trying to take care of the people and trying to do what's in most of the time their own best interest, but often the best interest of the people at large too, the community, if they present a risk. In this case, the only risk that was presented was the one she presented to herself going into these environments. So, and I was sickened by the behavior that I was watching. I mentioned earlier, I believe, the quote about the drunkards, and that definitely was there. And as I say it, I remember parts of the dream where I could smell the smells, the extreme alcohol and the drugs in the air, but the urine and the vomit, the disgusting smells. So I went to a guy at the bar who turned around and he had makeup on his face, a lot of it. And I said, "Did you see a woman come in here?" And he kind of snorted and said, "You don't see her? She stands out like a sore thumb. She doesn't fit in here." And he kind of nodded, and I turned and I looked, and the tables were not completely full, but busy with lots of people doing those things that I mentioned. And in the middle, seated at a table, was the young girl that I was pursuing. And she had put on, like this person I just spoke to, a lot of makeup on her face, trying to disguise herself and trying to blend in because most of the people there had a similar look and appearance to them. They had lots of makeup and adornment and suggestive, sexually suggestive clothing. So I remembered how much my heart broke when I saw her, how ruined and broken she looked. And she didn't know it. And she thought that this huge amount of makeup and the clothing made her look better. And I walked over to the table and I leaned forward. I put my hands on the table to talk to her and tell her I wanted to help her to get out of there, and suddenly woke up. And when I woke up, uh, I had all those feelings I described: the nausea, the disappointment, the frustration, the fear for her, and the confusion because she just wasn't listening to what was best for her. And I remember shaking my head and reaching for a glass of water, and I said, that was weird. What in the world was that? And suddenly I got my answer. Immediately it flooded me with answers. Even as I do this, more things are coming to me about that, and I'll try to be concise. I thought about the book of Hosea, and in the book of Hosea, the prophet Hosea is ordered, commanded by the Lord to marry a prostitute. Hosea 1 2. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." And that's pretty harsh, difficult language. And I don't even think this is the most difficult passage regarding this type of activity, in the Bible. This is just one of many. I mentioned earlier, but the prostitution references and in this case the word whoredom, they represent straying from God. They represent turning your back away from Him and towards other gods that you worship or idols. Now, in the ancient civilizations around the time that the Bible was written, often physically worshipped other gods. And that is certainly still very prevalent too. But of course, as I mentioned, there are other things too, like the money and doing what the crowd wants and seeking those worldly pleasures, the drugs and the alcohol and the sexual activities. And uh, I realized too that another prayer request had been answered with that dream because I asked for more empathy and ability to see the world through God's own eyes and perspective. And I asked in my prayers for more understanding from a spiritual sense of the spiritual realm and the world around me. And I realized in this dream that the woman running away from me was us. She was God's children, God's people, especially Christians. And she was trying so hard to fit in this depraved days of Lot, into this broken culture, substituting false gods for Him. And I thought about the fact that we as the church are to be married as a bride to Christ, who will be the groom. And truthfully, as a, a tough guy, you know, a guy who uh, works out, is on the police department, and you know competes and fighting and all this stuff. I never understood or wanted to understand that because of the feminine context of being a bride. But I suddenly understand with this what it actually means. I understand that my wife is a person that, as strong and capable and independent as she is, I'm tasked with protecting her and guiding her, and my kids too. And when there are things that I can't protect them from, it breaks my heart completely, utterly. And if that's the way with my faults and flaws that I feel, just imagine how God feels about the people that He created to be His family, to be His children, His heirs, to worship Him, and yet they're running away. At one point in the dream, I reached out and I grabbed her arm, the young girl's arm. And again, I wasn't trying to arrest her, so there was no intent, though I was authorized to do so, and I legally could have used force to arrest her and file charges against her. That wasn't my intent. My intent was to gently give her guidance and pull her back in and draw her into safety to protect her. And I could feel when she yanked her arm away from me angrily and yelled something at me and turned and ran away. It was heartbreaking. And I think that's us. I think we're yanking our arm away. We're saying, I want to do this. And I know that you say this is the law, but this is what I believe. And we're looking out for ourselves. We're getting caught in drunkenness and debauchery and deviancy because it's that pleasure that we're seeking, that false God. So to see it from that perspective was um, difficult. It broke me. It breaks me now to talk about it. The heart wrenching feeling of seeing her with all of that makeup on, trying to blend in with the evildoers of the world. In Joel, if we return to that, it says in Joel 2:12 through 13, "Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, and fasting, and with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. And he relents over disaster." In Proverbs 9:10 it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." This was for you. This was for me. Stop running away. Stop pulling from his grasp. He's not going to pursue forever. He will pursue you. I mean, he will continue to pursue you to the ends of the earth. But at a certain point, when you turn your back on him, you may be at a point where you can't turn back. Time is short. Even if I'm wrong and these things that we're seeing in the crazy world around us aren't the things that were written down in Daniel and Joel and Isaiah and Revelation, even if those aren't the things that are occurring and I'm misinterpreting it, you never know what the next day will bring for you. As a police officer, I saw so many times horrific, instantaneous tragedies where people died, never again to be seen. I saw it all the time. And I often stood there thinking, what if they just had a few minutes? What if they just turned a different direction? This could have been avoided. Don't be that person. Don't put it off. This is urgent. I'm talking to you. So find your fear, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Find it again. Be fearful of what may come if you don't. Stop running away. Stop turning to other idols, like a prostitute, away from the marriage and the groom who pursues you passionately, lovingly, persistently, consistently. It's time to come back. I love you all.